Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, as nations crippled by COVID-19 hoard their vaccines, Australia moves to develop a homegrown mRNA supply. Joe Biden says we can't stop here as Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is declared guilty of the murder of George Floyd. And Australia's pregnant pause, why our fertility rates are plummeting and what happens if we can't replace ourselves. Joining me on the panel tonight, economist and former Labor Minister Craig Emerson. Lovely to see you as always.
Thank you.
In Melbourne, GP and health commentator Dr. Vyom Sharma. Hi, Vyom.
G'day.
On Stradbroke Island, former Liberal ACT Chief Minister and Small Business Ombudsman Kate Carnell, getting around on a tinny, living the dream. G'day, Kate.
Hi, how are you?
Very well.
You know, as a fellow Queenslander, we know that's the way to be.
That's the way to do it. And in Alice Springs, CEO of Common Ground, a not-for-profit that aims to elevate First Nations cultures, histories and experiences, Rona, Glynn-McDonald. Wonderful to see you again.
Hi.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. Now, here's a fact that might stop you in your tracks. Last week, the world recorded the single largest number of new COVID cases of any point during the pandemic. It means any prospect of international borders opening remains distant. We do know, though, that the key to open borders is an effective vaccine rollout. And with the locally produced AstraZeneca vaccine not advised for anyone under 50, it all rests on the doses we've ordered from overseas, which are in short supply.
There's plenty of Pfizer coming, but it's coming at a time which is still being negotiated with Pfizer, but back-ended to the end of the year more than the beginning of the year. And they are doing their best as a company to increase their supply, but the forward view that they can give us of supply with certainty is limited. Were we to do a deal with a company like Moderna, it is unlikely that they would supply doses any more quickly than we can get them from Pfizer. Our unofficial advice is that they would be unlikely to meet supplies before Q4 this year.
Both of these are mRNA vaccines, a new type of vaccine technology that's been accelerated through the pandemic, and it's a technology that Australia is now investing in. The Drum's Eliza Harvey explains.
CSL is manufacturing the AstraZeneca vaccine in its Melbourne plant. Now, the Victorian government has committed $50 million to building technology that would support the Pfizer vaccine.
What we have seen through the course of the pandemic has been the benefits of mRNA vaccines. Low cost, rapid development, high efficacy, safe administration. This is a great vaccine.
Pfizer is the best-known mRNA vaccine, which uses what's called a messenger RNA, a genetic material our cells read to make proteins, which is the same protein as the spikes on the coronavirus. The AstraZeneca vaccine goes a different way to get an immune response, using DNA inside the shell of a virus that causes the common cold. It will take at least 12 months to establish the new technology to build the Pfizer vaccine. The government will work with the universities of Melbourne and Monash, as well as the Doherty Research Institute, to manufacture it.
This will certainly give us the ability to make this type of vaccine probably within about 12 months. However, we don't know how long it would take to make the precise and exact Pfizer or Moderna mRNA vaccines.
The federal opposition says the government has been shown up by the Victorian investment.
As we've seen time and time again in this pandemic, a state government has had to step in where Scott Morrison has been too slow to act. The Australian Academy of Science and many other experts have been calling for months now for Australia to build an mRNA manufacturing capability here in Australia.
Scientists have been lobbying the federal government to invest in mRNA technology, given the scope for it to be used beyond COVID to fight diseases like cancer.
I would say the response has been, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what emerges. And that has put us on the back foot. If we had been bold, then we would have jumped sooner into this. I guess I would characterise it as cautious without a sense of urgency. And I think that's exemplified by, small steps like ordering consultants to look into the feasibility. At the point at which the Pfizer vaccine was approved in November last year would have been the perfect time to jump in, but it's still not too late.
Vyom, let's start with you. Coulda, shoulda, woulda produced the mRNA vaccines, but the PM says last year the sort of technology, I guess you'd call it, the whole idea of these vaccines was just a theory. Were they right to be cautious last year?
Well, I suppose I can be charitable in that, that's the strong counter-argument to this, which is that we're looking at the horse which won the race and wishing we bought a ticket. But of course, in reality, as soon as those phase 3 trials came out, knowing the capability of mRNA platforms, not just for COVID, but for other diseases, it's a very strong argument that we should have invested. But I think this just kind of points to this general philosophy we have in this country when it comes to expenditure on health and biotechnology and biomedicine, which is we look for a return, and that return better come very, very quickly. Otherwise, we're just not going to put the money in, which is not really the way to think about these things. It's such a different philosophy to the way we say invest in defence, where you'll spend $90 billion on a few submarines that you'll hopefully never use, because we've got this understanding that it's there to prevent a disaster. And yet that's not the way we invest in research and development when it comes to health and biotechnology in this country. So I think that's really the big lesson here, that we need to reframe our entire approach, respect the concept of asymmetric risks. That's what we're really trying to mitigate here, the big public health issues like pandemics, and we can hopefully make better decisions. We know for a fact that even in the short term, from this point onwards, obviously mRNA vaccines are going to be very useful. So yes, November would have been the perfect time, and even then we've been a bit slow.
Craig, there's that idea, isn't there, of obsolescence, that you're going to invest in it and, maybe you'll need it in order to produce vaccines in the future if COVID keeps changing, mutating, you need booster shots, or maybe it'll just, boost a profitable biotech sector in Australia.
Well, you do need to have some sort of notional risk assessment when you're doing this sort of thing.
But presumably that's what all the grey-haired chaps who are the chief health ministers, they all look alike, are saying in all the political offices.
But that's my point. I mean, this is a 1 in 100 year...
They don't. A lot of them are women. Go on.
A 1 in 100 year pandemic.
Yeah.
And if you're doing a risk assessment, you'd have to be just say, we're going to have to do something here. We can't wait until we do all the economic modelling and so on, because the consequences of not having the vaccine are bad for health, but also bad for jobs, bad for the economy.
So, but you're assuming somebody said that to Greg Hunt in, let's say, November last year.
I'd hope he'd say it to himself, because what I've said is not profound. And I think that this is the one responsibility, that old phrase, you had one job, and it was to roll out the vaccine. I thought the Commonwealth had the responsibility for quarantine, but it said, no, that's got nothing to do with us, which is a bit strange, because when you come in on a plane from overseas, the people at Border Force are Commonwealth officials. Anyway, that's sort of, in a sense, come and gone. But they did accept that they had the responsibility for obtaining the vaccine, and it seems what they really did is, no, we're not going to produce it at home, we'll just put in an order. And putting in an order, if you're buying stuff online or in a shop, doesn't mean it's going to arrive.
Kate, it's interesting, in some of the reporting that I've seen today, there's a person called Associate Professor Archer Fox, who is with the Australian RNA Production Consortium. She was just in the package there, and said that they'd been lobbying the government since the middle of 2020. Yes, some understandable scepticism at that stage, but by about November, right, it's looking like a winner. I wonder to what extent whether there aren't sort of these... I always assumed, we're about to talk about industrial relations, that the head of the ACTU would always be talking to the head of the AI group or the head of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And I always assumed that the health minister would always be talking to the head of the Australian RNA Production Consortium, but maybe not so. They do in Canada, don't they?
Look, I think that what we're lacking in Australia is something that Canada's got and lots of other countries have got too, and that's the National Research Council of Canada. And what they do is they bring together research that's done at universities or in other places. We do great research in Australia. What we don't do is commercialise that or partner with business that can take our research to the next phase. So the National Research Council provides that collaborative space, that partnership space that gives you a capacity to commercialise. We do good R&D, but we do bad commercialisation, and we've simply got to get a whole lot better. And when the NRC in Canada was formed, they were the same as us. You know, they weren't very good at commercialisation. They've improved significantly since they put this entity in place. And this entity is spending quite a lot of money at the moment on research into COVID, what the next thing will be, what will happen in the future, and that's exactly what we should be doing here. I think, though, we've got to remember that the reason we're going to have trouble getting more Pfizer vaccine into Australia is we don't have any cases, or not many cases, of COVID, and it's probably reasonable globally to be sending doses to the countries that need them most, where people are really dying.
Yeah, Rona, can I turn to you? I mean, a lot of these conversations do come down to judgments about leadership, and as Vyom said, you know, everybody wishes they'd back the horse that won. But you contrast this to the way in which Aboriginal health organisations, particularly community-controlled health organisations, have just done such a sterling job through this whole time.
Yeah, we've seen incredible leadership from First Nations organisations, Aboriginal controlled health organisations, who show incredible leadership in their own communities. And I think from my perspective, administering and rolling out this vaccine is just as important as the supply challenge that we're seeing across the globe right now. We need place-based strategies that are driven by communities that know their needs, that have that deep engagement to ensure that our most vulnerable communities get the vaccine first. And we've seen, you know, during the context of COVID-19, we saw our communities, our elders leading the way in terms of how we responded to the first moments of COVID-19. And I believe that our Aboriginal controlled organisations have lessons for all systems across Australia to learn from.
It's interesting, Rona, because I remember Pat Turner talking with the Prime Minister, being in the courtyard of the Prime Minister's Parliament House offices there, and sort of saying, righto, Biosecurity Act, prevent access to people, this is how we're going to do it, boom, 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 boom. And it was all kind of worked out very, very quickly in an extraordinary way. And I'm not saying that governments in Australia didn't do that, but it really has been sort of flawless, hasn't it?
Yeah, we've seen incredible leadership.
Yeah. Now, we don't hear the phrase political bastardry enough these days, but that's just what a group of small business representatives have accused the government of. They are angry that plans to criminalise wage theft were dropped from the Industrial Relations Omnibus Bill. Tougher penalties for underpaying bosses had been included, but were taken out before the bill was passed through Parliament.
A complete abrogation of responsibility to all employees and businesses who are doing the right thing and have been undercut by a small number of businesses doing the wrong thing. To not do that would be morally bankrupt, in my view.
But a spokesperson for the Industrial Relations Minister, Michaelia Cash, has stressed the coalition is already leading the way for workers who are underpaid, with $123 million recovered from them last financial year. Kate, let's start with you. You were very recently the Small Business Ombudsman, so maybe you have some sympathy for the position of the small business lobby here, that failure to criminalise wage theft, an act of political bastardry.
Look, it's a really big problem for small businesses that are doing the right thing, paying their staff appropriately, are at a disadvantage if there is a large number of businesses in a particular sector that aren't doing the right thing. Now, we know that's the case in restaurant, catering, cafes, that there's a lot of underpayment. We've seen that as a result of Fair Work Ombudsman work. We know it's happening in the horticulture space. So those businesses that are doing the right thing do find it really difficult to compete with those that aren't. I think there's two issues here, though. One is that the industrial relations system, and I think everyone accepts this, is very complex. So there's one issue, and that's it's very complex. So small businesses and others do make mistakes. Now, I don't think that should be criminal. I think it should be something that you possibly get a fine and you have to fix it. Criminal is when businesses set out to underpay their staff, I should say, and that's a crime, just like anything else. It's stealing.
It's interesting, Craig. I mean, this was included. This was one of the elements of that big effort over the course of last year.
By a very willing government. I mean, it wasn't the opposition or the crossbenchers that put this in. It was the government. And then when it lost 4/5 of the legislation, it was in 5 parts, and the crossbenchers joined with Labor and the Greens in voting down the 4. So there was this surviving bit, which included this, that is dealing with wage theft. The government pulled that out and let the other bits and pieces go through. I don't know if it was vengeful, but if it was such a good idea before they pulled it out, why did it suddenly become a bad idea to have them remove that? And Kate's point's absolutely right. You see, people time and time again saying, just tell me what the award rate is and I'll pay my employees that. But then they get undercut by people who have no intention of paying that. And now you have, I think it's very heartening. You've got small business organisations and larger business organisations saying, we are asking you to deal with wage theft, not, let us pay whatever we want, but we need you to level the playing field for us. So it's not just the unions, it's the businesses who are arguing for it.
Rona, it's interesting. I wanted to explore the issue of whether there's an industrial relations club in Australia. What do you think?
We're not in it.
I don't know. I think that, we really need to see government take action on this. And when we look at those most impacted for wage theft, it is young people who exist within the casualised workforce, within highly flexible and insecure work. And, last year there was so much research that came out about how young people were most impacted by not having enough protections in the workforce. But when we look at the way that industrial relations is done across Australia, very few voices from marginalised communities, from young people, from those most impacted by different legislation are centred in the way that legislation's created. So I would like to see any kind of reform co-designed and co-produced with marginalised communities, with young people, with those that are really going to be most impacted by any kind of shift in the wage theft system and employment system more broadly.
Vyom, I don't know whether you caught up with you and Hannon's reporting that we sent around earlier today, but essentially the employer groups are turning on each other. You've got the Business Council of Australia on one side, you've got the small business organisations on the same side, and basically the ACTU over there saying, let's get on and let's get this deal done and, let's drive productivity and wages growth in this country. And you've got the Australian Mines and Metals Association, you've got the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the AI Group, Australian Industry Group, according to this reporting, saying to the government, if you push through that legislation that the other side would prefer, we will campaign against you. And instead, you should put forward this doomed legislation that we all know will fail in the Senate. Does that sound like a club, a powerful club?
Yeah, and it feels like some voices are missing, because when you look at the fact that the argument that's being brought here is that, hey, this wage theft is unlevelling the playing field, we're looking at it yet again through the lens of how it's affecting businesses. And I'm going, hang on, isn't the primary issue that it's actually employees who are not who are losing out? They're getting their money kind of taken away, and it's looking at it from an outside view, it's just bizarre that even when we're addressing what's a very obvious issue of wage theft that affects the least powerful in society, yet again it's been done through the lens of how does this serve the interests of business, which may well be valid, but that's the voice we're missing in this entire conversation.
I can see you looking frustrating before we move on, Kate, looking frustrated. I mean, the idea was some people said, well, the government wanted to hold the wage theft back in the hope of getting some other changes as a sweetener to get some other changes through. And some of those bigger employer groups are saying, well, unless you clean up the system, you can't have the wage theft stuff.
Look, the reality is the system desperately needs to change. It's too complex. It's difficult. There are lots of different wage rates that almost nobody can get right. Remember that the vast percentage of businesses in Australia are small businesses. Something like 99% of them are quite little, and they're really struggling. And it's wrong to say that the only losers are the employees. For those small businesses that are doing the right thing and paying their staff in line with the award, it's really hard for them to compete with those that aren't.
You've made that point, and you've told us that you wagged your finger at your son when he set up a cafe in Canberra and he was paying the right amount and he was getting undercut left, right and centre. So just finally, is there an IR club, Kate, that seeks this sort of stuff?
Of course there is. Yeah. There always has been.
A note of optimism. We now have an alliance between the ACTU representing the unions, plus the Small Business Association, COSBOA, and the Big Business Association, the Business Council of Australia. Maybe they should continue to work together on some reforms, the sort that Kate's talking about. Good for employees, good for employers. And if the others want to come in, they can come in later. Or if they want to campaign against it, well, let them campaign. But it's a pretty substantial group.
And look, I know I'm getting shouted at to move on. I'm trying to understand how power works. Is the IR Club resisting change because they get lobbying fees and legal fees out of the status quo? Is that too cynical a view of the world? Or have they got genuine issues that is more complicated?
Look, sometimes they have issues that we don't fully appreciate.
Right.
So I don't say they're bad people and they tried to destroy the whole, destroy the joint.
Yeah.
Their interests didn't coincide, but the only way of resolving that is getting back together and say, okay, look, we've got a few bruises, look, and join to become a larger group of workers and businesses, go to government, say, here, this is agreed.
Here's what we want to do.
Can I just say, remember that there's a union club too. There's two clubs. There's the business club and the union club. Yeah. And they both operate that way to stop any change that doesn't suit their membership. So don't put this all down on the business side.
And just tell me that one little story about how rough the union club can be, Kate.
Well, I've had a number of situations. One particular one where I was dealing with the TWU in New South Wales when the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal situation was in place and small truck drivers were doing it really tough. I went to a meeting with the TWU in New South Wales, just me, and I'm not that big. I'm really short. To have a meeting with the head of the TWU in New South Wales, he brought with him 10 big blokes in blue singlets, and they just bullied. They used words that you wouldn't use on TV that start with F and C, and just yelled at me. In fact, I'm pretty hard to intimidate, but I was actually shaking after that meeting. And that's not the only experience I could go through. It's a tough game, but it's really not reasonable. We need a new accord, back to the olden days, Craig, but that's what we need. This is just stupid on both sides.
And Bob Hawke, back in 1983, when they were creating that accord, said publicly, because they were having dinners and everything else together, employers, CEOs, had never met the union officials who are at the same table. And I think this is your point. I mean, why can't people meet and socialise, understand each other's difference? When we did the National Reform Summit in 2015, we decided not to argue about the things that we disagreed on, but to work on those things we called finding common ground. Let's have that philosophy and we will make progress.
Works at Christmas dinner anyway at my place, watching the drum. And with me on the panel are economist and former Labor Minister Craig Emerson, in Melbourne, GP and health commentator Dr Vyom Sharma, on Stradbroke Island, former Liberal ACT Chief Minister, and Small Business Ombudsman Kate Carnell, and in Alice Springs, CEO of Common Ground, Rona Glynn-McDonald. Nearly 11 months ago, an horrific crime was committed in the US city of Minneapolis. A white police officer pinned a black man, George Floyd, to the ground and pressed his knee to his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, slowly suffocating him to death. Floyd's death sparked worldwide protests, and his final words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry for racial injustice across the globe. And today, in a courthouse ringed by National Guards and razor wire, Derek Chauvin, the officer at the centre of it all, was found guilty of his murder.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. Same caption, verdict count 2. Same caption, verdict count 3.
We got justice. We got justice. We won.
It means a lot to my family. I'm happy they decided gave the right decision.
God, please let the healing work begin.
It was a motion picture. The world seeing his life being extinguished. And I could do nothing but watch. I'm gonna put up a fight every day because I'm not just fighting for George, I'm fighting for everybody around this world.
We are all a part of George Floyd's legacy.
I'm anxious to see you guys. We're gonna get a lot more done.
Nothing can ever bring their brother, their father back. But this can be a giant step forward in the march toward justice in America.
We don't find pleasure in this. We don't celebrate a man going to jail. We would have rather George be alive. Amen. But we celebrate because young people, white and black, marched and kept marching. And this is an assurance to them that if we don't give up, that we can win some rounds.
For more on this, we're joined in Bega by lawyer and human rights advocate Martin Hodgson. Thanks so much for joining us, Martin.
Thank you.
You've worked with death row inmates in the United States, African-American men you believe are wrongfully convicted. You helped get Rodney Reed off death row in Texas. Were you watching the verdict when it came in?
Yeah, I've watched the entire trial. I don't really think justice was achieved today. I think there was a small amount of accountability and that's about it.
What was your reaction on watching that judge open that yellow envelope? Because there were a lot of, I'm told, young African-American people outside and they didn't have a lot of hope that they were going to hear a triple guilty verdict.
Yeah, no, that's definitely sentiments of the community that they weren't hopeful. But at the same time, I think this trial was very different. For the first time, we saw a police chief really hold his own officer accountable. We saw the longest serving officer of that department talk about just how long it was and that it did constitute murder. And the forensic evidence was overwhelming. So as much as I've been disappointed by the justice system in the United States for a long time, I was quite confident the guilty verdict would be handed down.
Yeah, you were confident today. And so, what strikes me about the sort of work that you've done, you know, sitting on those telephones with the death row inmate on the other telephone, on the other side through plexiglass, is that you must have lost faith in US justice, in the court system.
Yeah, well, I don't have a lot of faith in the justice system in the United States or in Australia. I've seen and spoken to too many clients who have done nothing. The forensic evidence shows they've done nothing. The witness statements show they've done nothing. And yet, very often, they're in prison because they were forced to confess. And some of those confessions we have on video. And yet, these same men, Aboriginal in Australia, African American in the United States, end up losing their entire lives to the prison system. It's a disgrace.
Mm. When you look at Rodney Reed, I know it's a complex case, but I mean, what seems to be to have come to light is that a police officer's DNA was all over the crime scene where Rodney was said to be the perpetrator. Those matters are still being resolved. But, I mean, would that happen if you took away race and class in America?
Yes, absolutely it would, because if you look at the situation as it stands, I mean, the police have a licence to kill, both in Australia and in the United States. Yes, we've seen some accountability today, but it's one conviction in thousands and thousands of deaths. I mean, how can anyone hold any hope? The other issue is that there is no contest between parties in Rodney Reed's case. That Jimmy Fennell, the fiance of the victim, his DNA was at his DNA was on the Rodney Reed, my client, was 150 miles away. So his neighbour was his partner. His neighbour helped cover up the crime. Stacey Fennell died inside her home, murdered by her fiancé. And yet that officer was allowed to serve 10 more years until he raped and kidnapped another woman. And that was a white woman. And then finally that officer was struck off and he went to jail. So, look, we can talk about hypotheticals, but these are facts and it happens every day.
Well, when the Black Lives Matter protest first spread around the world, writer Cole Brown was a regular on the program. He's now back in the US and joins us from Los Angeles. Good to see you, Cole. Were you watching this verdict today?
I absolutely was. It's good to be back with you, Ellen. I was, and I'm encouraged by it, but certainly not. The battle is not over in terms of equality when it comes to policing.
Yeah. What does it represent? Do you ascribe any meaning to this verdict today, Cole?
You know, I think it's difficult to ascribe too much meaning when you consider just how egregious the offense was. I mean, you know, we're looking at a murder that we all saw on camera. So it's hard to draw too much hope from murderers going to prison when we watch them murder people.
So in other words, 9 minutes and 29 seconds of a man, you know, in excruciating agony, pleading for his life, crying out to his dead mother.
Yeah.
And that is the level of violence.
Right.
And the level of proof that is necessary to secure a conviction.
And I think that that's where I struggle to draw hope. I think that we saw in the immediate aftermath some people making broad claims about how you know, this may usher in a brighter day. Perhaps that's possible, but I know that exactly what you said, such an egregious example of violence, and one that requires so much in the way of evidence in order to put the first white police officer in history in the state of Minnesota behind bars for murder while on duty. It is not encouraging to me to know that that is the bar that is required to cover in order to put murderers behind bars.
Rona, we saw the Vice President there talking about Floyd's legacy. We saw the President of the United States say that that video shot by a 17-year-old witness, Darnella Frazier, ripped the blinders off for the whole world to see. What's George Floyd's legacy in Australia, and has anything changed as a result of what happened in that courtroom today?
Look, I think it's been said by so many people across the world today. That is the beginning of accountability. You know, we're not seeing justice yet. There is so much more that needs to be done before we can say there is justice in the US and there is justice in Australia as well. So from my perspective, justice looks like no more deaths. It looks like real change. It looks like people on the ground not fearing for their lives when they leave their homes or when they're in their homes. And we have such a long way to go in Australia until we reach that point. But my hope is that this case sets precedent, not in just the US, but across Australia as well, in terms of centering the voices, the videos, the experiences of families and communities who have been witness and continue to be impacted by deaths in custody in ongoing ways. And when we look at the current state in Australia, we have had 0 convictions for the 474 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have died in custody since 1991. Now, that is a national shame. Not one person has been convicted from any of the systems that have impacted First Nations communities through murdering our young people, our old people, and inflicting colonial violence. I hope that this process and this conviction will lead to future juries across Australia thinking deeply about how we need to humanise the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within the judicial system and hear the voices of families and communities most impacted. You know, when we look across the system right now, rarely are those voices heard, rarely are they centred, and they are very rarely acted upon. And I think it's going to be a long way until we see that justice across Australia, but I hope that we will see it soon.
Martin, can I turn to you before I go to the broader panel? A couple of people retweeted, reposted the Minneapolis police original statement about the George Floyd incident. Man dies after medical incident during police interaction. Officers from the Minneapolis Police Department responded to a report of a forgery in progress. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He died a short time later. If Darnella Frazier hadn't filmed what happened and uploaded it to social media, Martin, where would this case be?
Well, it'd be like all the other cases. It'd be nowhere. But I think we want to be very careful in Australia not to throw stones at glass houses, you know. In Australia, the exact same crime has been caught on camera. David Dungay Jr. was held down by more than half a dozen corrective services officers. Wayne Fella Morrison was put in a spit hood, the same prone position as George Floyd, with more than half a dozen officers again on his back, and he is dead. So, yes, you know, if it had been caught on camera, we'd be nowhere. But at the same time, these crimes are caught on camera in Australia, and we're getting nothing. And I really don't think the motherhood statements or anything like that help. We need to go back to what the Royal Commission recommended 30 years ago, which is that these deaths be treated like a homicide, because they are. They're not like deaths in custody. They're murders by police officers and corrective services. Let's just be honest about it. We're not going to get anywhere. At the same time as the Royal Commission, we have the Fitzgerald inquiry in Queensland, and the Commissioner of Police went to prison for corruption. But what no one ever talks about is all the deaths that happened on his watch of Aboriginal people, the murders that were covered up, the suicide, how weapons were allowed to get into prison service. Look at what happened at the old Hetman Creek prison and the number of suicides there in what was supposedly safe cells, where somehow people managed to get roped in and hang themselves. Someone took that rope in. So we need to start having honest conversations in Australia. We need to stop this focus of always hoping that what happens in America will trigger us into action. It won't. We saw what happened to Robert Reed. They did nothing, we do nothing. We need to address the original sin, and it takes political leadership. It shouldn't take young girls on the street with a camera. Paul Keating, when he gave the Redfern address, not only did he say we took land, we stole it. He said we committed the murders and we took mothers' babies away. And sadly, since that very true statement, and he was very good on this issue, we have seen a litany of cowards in power who do nothing to end these deaths.
Cole, talk to me about Biden. Talk to me about what Biden said.
Yeah, you know, it's encouraging to see the statements from Biden and him come out against this. You know, one thing that I thought was special about Biden's response to this crime was that he was calling this, he had made his mind up. He, being the president of the United States, had made his mind up before the jury had. That is exceedingly rare. So there's one encouraging element there. I think another thing, you mentioned the police statement, the official police statement earlier, and I just want to touch on that briefly, because I totally agree with the statement that had there not been video recording of this event, it would have been covered up. But another encouraging element about this trial is the fact that you saw for the first time in recent memory, certainly in my lifetime, police officers coming out against one of their own. The statement was an example of police officers being complicit in a cover-up. But you saw in the trial a senior sergeant in that office, as well as the police chief of Minneapolis, coming out against Derek Chauvin. So that was encouraging. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there's just too much more work to be done and too many more tragic examples, like Dante Wright happening only a couple miles away.
He was the fellow who was shot, where the police officer says she confused the taser and the gun.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. And happened again, 10 miles from the courthouse where the verdict was handed down today. So I think that there's just too much else going on for us to sit back and clap our hands in this moment. It's certainly the better of the two alternatives. But there's still a lot of work to be done.
And just finally, before we come back to an Australian example, I draw the wider panel in. I also noted that the prosecution's strategy, Cole, was to say, we're not talking about the whole force, we're just talking about this guy. And there's 3 other people who are going on trial for this, because we saw it in that 9-minute and 29-second video. And so they wanted to secure the conviction of this man. They didn't want to talk to in this courtroom about systemic racism and issues with policing more generally. So is that what gives you pause?
No, because I think that as a legal strategy, that makes sense. And again, you can't, the reality of that video is so unavoidable that as a legal strategy, I think that makes sense. And I think the prosecutors did an excellent job. I think it is the job of society and the job of politicians and many of our institutions to have those much broader conversations about systemic injustice.
Well, before we move on, I want to show you this report from Channel 7 News. It's about a youth crime conference in Brisbane and calls from some for police to be monitoring young people from a very early age.
While every child is born innocent, too many are doomed to a life of crime.
We're talking about a child that might have been born with fetal alcohol syndrome.
There are signs even at preschool.
Those children that are showing very significant aggressive behaviour at age 4.
Calls at the National Youth Crime Symposium in Brisbane for earlier intervention.
We probably need to start from about age 5. We shouldn't start any later than when children go to school.
We have police liaison officers in high schools. I think we need to look at primary schools.
Rona, can I start with you? I know you were trying to avoid that video today. Well, let me just read on. Now, that piece you just watched has since been deleted from Channel 7's website and social media. They tell us that's due to their moderation guidelines. I don't know what that means. And did you spot the Griffith University academic? This is important, Rona. He was in there wedged between a line about calls for earlier criminal intervention and getting police liaison officers into primary schools. Well, we got in touch with him and he explained that his views have been drastically misinterpreted.
Totally opposed to kindergarten cops. I think police have no role anywhere in schools, primary or high, because they don't have the skills required to deal with the complex developmental problems that many of their conduct disorder, difficult behaviour kids have. I'm just shocked at what Channel 7 did, and I totally repudiate the implications of that story. Risk is not destiny. Even without any intervention, half the kids who are engaging in conduct disorder or serious antisocial behaviour at a young age turn out fine. And that's part of the science as well as the art of early prevention.
Right, okay. So this is the only place you're going to see that video, Rona, because they've scrubbed it off everything. But there was a sentence in the report that started off talking about young children, and let's face it, they were talking about Indigenous kids being victims of all kinds of abuse. And we see these little hands in some handcuffs, right? Clearly a child, not the hands of an adolescent. And then by the end of the sentence, they're referred to as budding offenders. So that's just one sentence in which that change happened.
That is the first time that I've seen that video.
Sorry.
And from my perspective, it is a completely disgusting colonial violent narrative that is being shared and perpetuated by Channel 7. I didn't want to watch it because I didn't want to give it airtime, but I think that it's really important to consider that our young people are our future. They are the strength and backbone of our future communities, and we need to be raising the age of criminal culpability in this country, not looking at ways to continue to over-police our people and our young people. It's just simply ridiculous, and I can't believe that they managed to make that section come together and share it across Australia.
Yeah, and so you're talking about raising the age of criminal consent from 10 to 14, which is what the UN recommends, because currently it's 10. Craig, can I go to you on this? It's interesting the way in which the Black Lives Matter movement is spoken about in Australia. The Deputy Prime Minister in January talked about Black Lives Matter protesters being part of a race riot. And today we saw the New South Wales Police Minister saying that a school teacher who had put up posters that the children had made of Black Lives Matter posters should be sacked. And was brainwashing children, not Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, white lives matter.
Yeah, I think when people say all lives matter, they're diminishing the importance of the argument that Black Lives Matter. Why are we having that debate? Why are we having that argument? Because African Americans, do suffer a lot of violence at the hands of police and other authorities. Indigenous Australians do as well, and that's the whole purpose of the Black Lives Matter revival, really, because it had been around.
But it's the question of what is considered radical in Australia. Do you consider that radical I don't. No.
And I don't. And I think, just a view that I'd formed based on the verdict today, just imagine for half a second that the verdict went the other way. American cities would be burning now. So thank goodness it went the way it went and the justice system worked. But what I think, I'm always trying to find something positive. And African Americans might now start to get a bit of evidence that things are changing. Some of the video you saw was President Biden on a mobile talking to them, Kamala
talking to
Harris,
the family.
To the family, and it's interesting in the last presidential election when Donald Trump was saying, these are radical people, we want to restore law and order. And, he was appealing to a particular demographic, but African Americans came out and voted in a very big way, which was one of the reasons that Donald Trump lost so badly and Joe Biden won so well. So I think maybe, hopefully, there's a sense of empowerment by African Americans who think, well, maybe we can make a difference. And I think that's why they weren't voting, because they say, what's the point of voting?
Cole.
Now they might say, there is a point.
Cole.
So, I'll jump in on a couple of those things. One, in terms of, sort of reaping this as a sign that things are changing. I mentioned this earlier, I'll say it again. I simply can't take too much encouragement, too much optimism from a videotaped murder sending someone to jail. That, to me, is just table stakes of being an American citizen. I think even the fact that we were so concerned that that would be the outcome suggests the dire straits that we are in right now as African Americans. So I would hesitate to present too much optimism in this moment. You also mentioned, and I'm glad you did, you brought up the fact that had it gone the other way, cities would likely be burning. I totally agree with that, but I want to quickly speak to why that is the case. I think that that's the case because had it gone the other way, you would see a police force that would be totally illegitimate in an American city.
Sure.
If something like this can be videotaped and the murderer go on with impunity, that means that force is illegitimate. And I just want to be sure that we make that point, because so often what those riots and protests are framed as somehow a society's ill rather than a problem with the institution that has caused that.
Well, let's see how it runs its course, but I think there's just a little glimmer of hope.
Could I just give something really positive just for a moment? Recently in Australia, an entity was set up called the Justice Reform Initiative under the patronage of Sir William Dean and Dame Quentin Bryce. Robert Tickner has been involved in setting it up. There are patrons of it at national and state level, senior politicians from all sides of the political spectrum, senior police people, senior people from the justice area.
What does it do, Kate? What does it do?
It's fundamentally saying jailing is failing. That we've got to invest more in alternatives to the jail system. We've now got the third highest incarceration rate in the world after New Zealand and then the United States. Higher than Canada, higher than Western Europe. This is simply unacceptable, and apart from it being expensive, it ends up with really bad outcomes for the people.
And a third of those inmates are Indigenous.
Yeah, let me go back to
a third of the population.
Let me go back to Martin. What you have those twin perspectives, right? This was actually put up with a police union representative there saying, and no Indigenous people being quoted, saying these kids are victims, but they're budding criminals, and so we should get cops into schools. Just reflect on that for me, Martin, in the Australian context and in the US context. Contrast it for me.
Well, when you have a vacuum where there's no accountability or responsibility, police will step into that and do what they always do and seek to police everyone. But it's pretty sick to talk about the criminality of kindergarten children. What's next? They want copies of ultrasounds. And I'm a little sick of the deference we pay to the police and the police ministers. David Elliott has got serving members of his department attending white nationalist, racist gatherings. He can focus on that before he talks about a teacher. Now, there's a few other things that I think are critical here. I've done this work for more than 17 years. I have never had a client reoffend. Anyone can go and look up my record. It's all public. Go and talk to Arnie Judy Tadow. Talk to Dr. Jan Hamill. Talk to Arnie Judy Atkinson. These are the people who have the answers and who have been delivering on the ground for decades, and they get the results. And yet, we never hear from these people. We hear from some criminologist who's now backpedaling, because yesterday afternoon, after seeing that, I rang his university, because they also made drastic errors on a case of mine that resulted in an Aboriginal man serving 30 years in prison for a case he didn't commit. So I'm not very impressed by ministers or professors or any of these people who supposedly know what they're talking about. They don't. And if you target children that young with police, I mean, what does that say about our society? What does it say about the apology to the stolen generation? And you wonder why Aboriginal women and Aboriginal mothers won't call the police when they're victims of domestic violence.
Let me bring in Vyom. Let me bring in Vyom. I'm interested, Vyom, about what we are allowed to talk about. This is interesting because the New South Wales Education Minister, and I'm keen to find the quote here, was basically saying that that racism in the criminal justice system, I found it, is not appropriate for students to consider. I've spent a lot of time, Vyom, in drafty debating halls of a Friday night, and it sounds like absolutely standard fare for what students debate, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I debated in high school, and these topics weren't exactly off limits. And what else is education for if we can't talk about these extremely fundamental problems about our society? We also had the Emergency Services Minister saying that this was all kind of breaching guidelines. I want to see exactly what these guidelines are, and if this does not fall within the ambit of education, then the problem is the education, I think, itself. The discourse is just so clearly immature here that all of a sudden, kids bringing up issues like Black Lives Matter in school is seen as this kind of anti-police kind of movement. I think we saw the Emergency Services Minister get very defensive about this. And it shows that they just still don't understand what the conversation is that's being had in America. And the conversation we need to have here, that it's not not just a narrow case of deaths in custody. It's about incarceration rates. It's about the differences in rates of police cautions versus arrests. There's all these very obvious cases of conscious bias that we have in police, as well as the kind of structural racism. If we aren't allowed to talk about it, we will never fix this. So the concept that we can't talk about it in schools, that's deeply troubling to me. Like if we talk about all the incursions on free speech, well, for once we're actually seeing it, and it really concerns me.
Cole, bring your American lens to that. So you got kids making Black Lives Matter protests, and the police ministers getting involved, the education ministers getting involved. It's front page news in the tabloids, and there's calls for the teacher to be sacked. And at the same time, there's a report on a mainstream outlet that says, let's get police liaison into primary schools to deal with complex issues of children who might have fetal alcohol syndrome and might be suffering physical and sexual abuse.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's direct parallels, right? One, obviously, you all don't have the gun violence issue that we do here in the States, but so often, particularly from the right and conservatives, what is seen as the solution to that gun violence issue, particularly when it comes to school shootings, is more guns in schools by virtue of police in the schools. We heard that from Trump. So there's a clear direct parallel there. And then there's also one when it comes to this freedom of speech and what is or is not appropriate to be talked about in the classroom issue. It was quickly disbanded by the Biden administration, but Trump had set up this 1776 commission, which was essentially going to look at education in the public schooling system, which was a direct response to the 1619 project that the New York Times had put out, which was a critical lens at looking at American history, particularly through the lens of enslavement and how that original sin has shaped our history. So I think that you're absolutely, the comment that I just heard is absolutely right. I think that it's at the very least ironic, if not outright hypocritical, that the same critics of quote unquote cancel culture and over wokeness are too hypersensitive to deal in any honest way with this nation's real history.
It's a hard day for you. Cole, are you finding this hard to have these conversations again and again?
It's not really a day, Ellen. I was in Australia having these conversations for a few months. We've been having this conversation for a year, and in many ways, I've been having this conversation my whole life. So yeah, it's tough, but there's many of these days, unfortunately.
What about you, Rona?
I think today I've just been thinking of the families that have experienced a death or a murder in custody, and I hope that they continue to show the strength and resilience that they have for years, and the generations of incredible, staunch leaders we have who are First Nations across the country. And going back to Craig's point, he said there is hope. Biden did meet with George Floyd. I hope that, or not
The
George
family,
Floyd, sorry,
yeah.
his family.
Yeah.
But I hope that Scott Morrison will meet with the families who've experienced a death in custody, who are calling to meet with our Prime Minister and have their voices and solutions centred to create that accountability and eventually that justice.
Martin, what's your feeling tonight?
Well, I think unfortunately we've been distracted by what Channel 7's done, what David Elliott's done, what teachers are doing. I reeled off a bunch of names of Aboriginal elders, women who have the solutions. I'd like to see them spoken to and listened to more than anything. I echo the point, listen to the families who have been through this. There can't be justice. George Floyd's family, they'll never get justice. The 474 Aboriginal families who have lost their loved ones. Auntie Tanya Day doesn't get to cuddle her grandkids anymore. So if we're serious, it can't be, motherhood statements and little things. We've got to do a lot right now.
We are out
My
of time.
grandma said to me today, she was
finally.
born during the Depression, that progress happens slowly. Well, it's too slow because all of this has been going on her entire life.
All right.
And in that time, we've overcome so much. We haven't overcome the racism that permeates this country.
Thanks,
It has to be
Martin.
now.
We are out of time. And if this topic has raised any issues for you, please call Lifeline 131114 or Beyond Blue 1300 22 4636.